The last book of the Old Testament that we're looking at today is Nehemiah. Now, Nehemiah was the king's cupbearer. He used to serve drinks to the king of Persia, who was the ruler of loads of countries, including Judah and Jerusalem, where Nehemiah and the Jews were from. And Nehemiah heard that the walls of Jerusalem were all broken. There were no gates. He was sad. So he prayed to God, and then he acted. Even though he was a bit scared, he said to the king, "Please let me go back and rebuild the walls." And God answered his prayer. He made it happen. Nehemiah was allowed to go back to Jerusalem with loads of building supplies so he could start rebuilding the walls. So I've got some bricks on my wall here, but they need rebuilding. And so Nehemiah got everyone involved in the rebuilding project. They all did their bit. If they lived in front of the wall, they repaired their bit of the wall. Or if they lived in front of the gate, they repaired their bit of the gate. They all chipped in to rebuild the walls. Whether it was just a normal person with a normal job, they helped out. Even the leaders helped out. They helped rebuild the walls as well. The priests, they helped rebuild the walls as well. It even mentioned someone who sold perfume. They helped rebuild the walls. Whoever they were, whether they were rich or poor, tradesmen, merchants, everyone helped out as they rebuilt the walls of Jerusalem. But some of their enemies were not happy. They made fun of them. They said, your walls are weak. Your walls are going to fall down. You've got no chance of rebuilding them. And they threatened to attack. So what did Nehemiah do? He prayed to God. And then he acted. He did something. He made sure that they could defend against enemies. So he said, half of you keep guard against enemies. And the other half of you carry on rebuilding the walls and growing them high. And everyone had a shield and a sword and a spear ready. So if they got attacked, they'd blow the trumpets, and everyone would come and defend the walls together. They carried on building, and God protected them. Then the enemies tried to scare Nehemiah. They tried to get him to come to a meeting so that they could kill him. What did Nehemiah do? He prayed. And then he did what he thought was best. He didn't go to the meeting. God protected him. And they kept going, they kept building, and the walls got higher and higher and higher till they were built up. They finished. They put the gates in place. And they'd close the gates at night so that no one could get in and attack, and open them in the day. Everything, all the walls and gates had been rebuilt. Well, hey! And when people heard, they all came back to live in the city, to live in the safety of Jerusalem. So that's the first thing we see in Nehemiah. We see the walls. The next thing we see is worship. Worship of God. And their worship started with reading the Bible. It started with them listening to God's word in the Bible. They read God's law all day. It was read out and they all listened. Imagine having an all day in assembly where you listen to God's word being read. That's what they did. They wanted to hear from God. They heard about all the good things God had done for them. That they were reminded how they kept rebelling and going against God. But they were reminded also of God's grace, his forgiveness. And they all said sorry to God. They all confessed their sins. And they promised to trust God and live God's way in the future. They promised to keep worshipping God, and so that the temple could stay open and they could keep worshipping God, they promised to give money to the priests and to the temple so that the worship could continue. Walls, worship. So everything looks so good, doesn't it, so far? In Ezra and Nehemiah, we see the temple rebuilt, the walls rebuilt, the community together worshipping God. But then at the very end of Nehemiah, in the very last chapter, things start going wrong. See, Nehemiah has to go back to the king, he has to go away. And then when he gets back, he says, what's going on? They've started rebelling against God again. So they're not giving money to the temple. So the priests have got nothing to live off. So they have to go and farm. And so worship can't happen. And they're working on the Sabbath, on the day God told them to rest. And they're not staying separate from the people around them. They're being led astray into sin. And that's really how the Old Testament ends. With Nehemiah telling them off for not living God's way. They're making the same mistakes again. Oh. So, Jerusalem, the temple, God's people back in the land. But there's still problems. It's nowhere near as good as those amazing promises that we heard about in the prophets like Ezekiel and Isaiah. We still need to wait for God to keep his promises fully, to make everything right again. At the end of the Old Testament, we're still waiting for Jesus. Jesus is the one who's going to come and make everything right. But we do learn from Nehemiah. I think Nehemiah teaches us how to be good leaders. When Nehemiah came across a problem, he didn't give up. He prayed to God. He was bold and he did what needed to be done. He loved God's word, the Bible. And he always tried to do what was right, even when others were doing wrong. Isn't that a good example for us in our lives?